All right, we are recording.
Thanks,
Thank
Fox.
you. Thanks. Mark usually does our introductions and he's very eloquent about it, but these are guests that I asked to join us today because Mark and Katie indicated that people might have questions about PFAS, and this is a group of professionals that work on water and water-related issues and or are curious about water issues. So I asked Brian and Bill to kind of give us a reprise of this presentation. They delivered it to, I think, the GIS Collaborative. What are PFAS? What are they indeed? What a question, Michael. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances are chemicals with carbon fluorine bonds and a few other things. So the short version, Bill is a senior GIS developer. I want to get your job title right, over for MNIT at MDH. I've been working over there for a few years now, since 2022. And Brian is an engineer in training in the drinking water, community public water supply unit. Sorry, I got it right. Got to read my notes here. So thank you both for joining us. I appreciate your time, and I will go ahead and hand it over to whoever is starting.
That would be me. So, all right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Fox. So today we'll be talking about the PFAS testing of Minnesota community water systems, as well as how we are displaying all of that testing via the dashboard. So we'll kind of have a two-tiered presentation here. So I'll kind of give the compliance side, more of kind of what MDH and drinking water protection are doing about PFAS, and then Bill will give kind of the MNIT side. So Bill, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, Bill Dando. Thank you. MNIT supporting MDH. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy for your help, Bill. Bill's been an incredible asset, as well as the rest of his team, on just kind of updating this dashboard and giving the whole state of Minnesota something pretty innovative to share with our I would say constituents, but that's the wrong word. Populace here in Minnesota. So without further ado, we'll get started. So if I can. There we go. So as I said, we'll kind of do a two-tiered presentation. So one, we'll talk about PFAS, what are polyfluoroalkyl substances. We'll touch briefly on kind of what some of our health-based guidance values are here in the state of Minnesota. And then we'll spend most of the time kind of talking about what I do, which is implementing the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. Bill, do you want to kind of
go? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yep, you're good. And then Bill talk about the dashboard, business needs, processing steps, and then some more info about the dashboard. So. All right, so what are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances? They are large class of surfactants. So that just means that they're chemicals that deal with the surface tension of water, and they're over the number on the screen here says 10,000. Depending on how you define it, there could be more, could be less. Really, the takeaway message here is that we're still learning quite a bit about these family of chemicals, and being that there are greater than 10,000 of them, each have their own unique chemical and physical properties that make them persistent in the environment. They've been around since the 1940s, and since have been integrated into a wide range of consumer and industrial applications and products. So as you see here on the screen, you have things like Gore-Tex, Scotchgard, Teflon. Those are kind of some of the more well-known PFAS consumer products. But because there are so many of them, they've been integrated into so many different products and processes that you may not necessarily think about, like things like fast food wrappers and cosmetics and AstroTurf and pesticides and aqueous firefighting foam. All of these, if it has like a water repellent, stain repellent, grease resistant, or heat resistant property, you can kind of suspect that PFAS may have been used in the production of that product. So kind of getting a little bit into the weeds here, we won't go too far, but what precisely what does a PFAS molecule look like, or what is that kind of made up of? And so if you kind of look at the caterpillar type molecule on the side of the screen here, that is more or less kind of an idealized version of a PFAS molecule. So the red atoms representing kind of this functional head, or like a carboxylate or sulfonate, kind of gives PFAS its own unique flavor, if you will. And then that, what you see on the end there is kind of this carbon chain tail. So each one of those having a fully fluorinated, so a carbon and fluorine bond taking up all of, or a fluorine atom taking up all of the possible connections to a carbon atom. And so that carbon fluorine connection is extremely strong. It takes a lot of high temperature or a lot of pressure to break that bond, right? And so that is pretty rare to find in the environment. And so for that they persist in the environment. So if they persist in the environment, we can only guess what that bodes for when they interact with the human body. And so for that reason, institutions like MDH believe that, or have taken the stance that PFAS are concerned to the health of all Minnesotans, namely because PFAS can increase health risks such as liver, immune, and thyroid effects following exposure over decades, over many years. So PFAS are chronic contaminants. They're not acute contaminants like when we're talking about in drinking water, things like nitrates, things like E. coli bacteria, things like that. Those are acute contaminants. They require a response immediately. Now PFAS we see the health effects spread across many decades or longer periods of time. So those are known as chronic effects, right? However, it is still important to take care of those things, even though they are chronic contaminants. And so, since we've started working with PFAS and discovered it in 2002, here in Minnesota, you can measure PFAS in the blood of most people in the state, and I would expand that to say most people in the world have some measurable quantity of PFAS. And now for our younger populations, such as fetuses and infants, those are the highly impacted demographics by PFAS, just because they consume the most amount of water per portion of body weight. And so PFAS can be passed from the mother to an infant, as well as during placental transfer. So there's plenty of impacts for younger people. And so because that carbon fluorine bond is so strong, these compounds can accumulate in the body over time. So again, since we've discovered PFAS in the state of Minnesota in 2022, MDH has developed these health-based guidance values for PFAS in drinking water. And as you can see, over time, those values have dropped precipitously. And that is because, as time passes, as we get, as we know more, as more research comes out, we can, kind of estimate the impacts on the human body and what a more appropriate concentration or exposure should be for humans. And so, as you can see, for PFOA, that was relatively high. But back in 2002, we didn't know that much about PFAS. So as we've learned more, as the technology has improved to detect and understand and give us better resolution of PFAS in mediums such as drinking water or groundwater or air and so on and so forth, right? We kind of understand how often we are exposed to PFAS. So that's what we've done on the state level. And so now, more or less the reason I was brought on into MDH is to help kind of implement this new national primary drinking water regulation that the Environmental Protection Agency, otherwise known as EPA, implemented last year. So back on April 10th of 2024, EPA published this new national primary drinking water regulation for that included enforceable limits for 6 different PFAS compounds. So under this new rule, there's about a couple of different activities that all public water supply systems must perform. And so the first is to conduct monitoring, and that is the time that is the period in which we are in right now. So we are conducting initial monitoring, and all that means is that EPA requires systems to establish a baseline for the levels of PFAS in their system. So the vast majority of systems do not have any form of PFAS, but that is obviously a sliding scale, and it's kind of a continuum of you have some PFAS, or you have just PFAS. You have PFAS detections that are under those enforceable limits, and then finally you have systems that are above those enforceable limits. So luckily, it's skews more towards not having PFAS, but of course we want to find those systems that have those vulnerabilities. So as a result of all that monitoring, so we're initial monitoring now. We'll begin compliance monitoring in 2027. So if during that monitoring there are detections of PFAS, or there's those levels exceed certain thresholds, such as those enforceable limits, then the EPA requires all public water systems to perform some form of public notification. So that can be as simple as reporting detections in the Consumer Confidence Report, which is that report that all water supplies publish every single year. Or it can be, something as complex as, hey, we have an MCL violation, so we will be taking these steps to address it. And then finally, if those levels do exceed certain thresholds, such as the maximum contaminant levels, EPA requires systems to implement solutions. And so, as an engineer, when I think about that, my mind immediately jumps to treatment, right? But that's not necessarily the case. Treatment is kind of like more or less the worst case scenario. But systems have other options, such as drilling new wells, finding new sources of water that don't have PFAS, and then connecting to public water supplies that are buying water from systems that don't have PFAS in them. And then finally, of course, getting treatment. And we say that treatment is kind of the, let's say, worst case scenario, but kind of the last option on the table, just because it is fairly expensive to implement. So I've alluded quite a bit to these maximum contaminant levels that were established in the original rule back in April of 2024. And so they are, as you see here on this table. So on the right-hand side of the column, you have all the chemical names. And then in the second column, you have these maximum contaminant levels, which are those enforceable standards. And so you'll note that each one of those is written in nanograms per liter. So for PFOA, PFOS, those are both 4 nanograms per liter. And so when we say nanograms per liter, that means parts per trillion. And so when I say parts per trillion, that's a very small number, something akin to 1 drop in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So when we're talking about 4 nanograms per liter, that's 4 drops in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So that is the level of detection that we are tasked to find or tasked to have at our institutions, such as the Public Health Lab here in the state of Minnesota. Now, the good news is, I will say that our Public Health Lab has more than that capacity to they get well under 4 nanograms per liter. However, EPA kind of has to set this threshold that all laboratories, regardless of where you are in the country, that they can reliably hit that, right? So even though we have pretty great resolution here in Minnesota, that doesn't necessarily mean, for example, a state like Wyoming or Alaska or, Delaware, who knows, right? Who knows what their standards are there. So that's part of the consideration of setting them so high. So you'll notice here on the table that a few of these compounds are italicized, and we'll touch on that later. But for PFHXS, GenX, and PFNA, their MCLs are 10 nanograms per liter. And then we finally have another MCL known as the hazard index. And so that MCL gets kicked into action if we have a detection of any of those italicized compounds. If there are 2 or more of those detections, then the MCL, the hazard index, comes into play. We also have something known as the MCLG, and that is just an idealized standard, being more or less being like, in a perfect world, if we had all the money and time and technology to throw at this problem, what would the ideal concentration of PFAS be in the water? And as you can see, for PFOA and PFOS, that would be no PFAS in the water. So keep that in mind as we go forward. As I alluded to, these were the standards up until May 14th of 2025, and that was only a few weeks ago now. It still feels pretty fresh, but the EPA issued a press release saying that For PFOS and PFOA, the MCLs of 4 nanograms per liter will stay the same. And we're like, okay, thanks. And then about 5 paragraphs down, kind of burying the lead, there was this line saying that the EPA is choosing to rescind the regulations and reconsider the regulatory determinations for the remaining 4 out of the 6 MCLs that were published. So that doesn't necessarily mean that these will go away. That just means that they are going to reconsider them and reevaluate whether they should be MCLs, whether they should go higher. We don't really know. Just kind of this, I guess, black veil that we don't know, we can't see behind. So, the EPA said that they will release a new draft rule in the end of 2025, as well as and then a final rule in the spring of 2026. So, they also mentioned that the compliance deadline the compliance deadline for coming or being under the MCLs is extended until 2020 or 2031, and then all the initial monitoring requirements will remain the same for detecting these PFAS. So that was kind of our curveball that we were thrown a couple weeks ago. However, in terms of completing initial monitoring, we are still on that same timeline. So right now, kind of the period that we are in is this initial monitoring. And so systems have basically from 2024 all the way until April 2027 to complete initial monitoring. And so depending on the size and source water type of your public water supply system, that drives the frequency and the amount of samples that you submit to the EPA to establish that baseline of PFAS in your drinking water supply. So as you can see, if you're a large system, or if you're a large groundwater community system or a non-transient non-community system, you submit 4 quarterly samples within the same 12-month period, spaced 2 to 4 months apart. And then if you're a smaller groundwater system, you submit 2 samples per entry point, spaced 5 to 7 months apart. And if you're a surface water system, then you're also on quarterly as well. So noting that we have just under 1,000 community water systems here in the state of Minnesota, as well as many more non-transient, non-community systems. We've hired a contractor to help systems complete that initial monitoring so we can get all of those samples submitted by 2027. And so we sent out a bid or sent out a solicitation for bids, and WSP USA won that bid. So they are traveling around the state, collecting all those monitoring samples at no cost to public water supplies. So MDH is more or less eating that cost. But the upside is that every single public water supply will have those monitoring requirements met by 2027. So if if a system reaches out to you and asks, we heard about some contractor and they claim to be working with MDH and it's WSP, you can reassure them that is that's not a scam, they are truly working with us. And they can contact either Corey or Barbara with those numbers listed on the page here. So going it from 2027 and then perhaps to 2031, again, that press release is only a press release. We don't actually know. That's just what they've proposed in there. But as far as we know, those will get pushed to 2031. So starting 3 years after rule promulgation, so in 2027, all initial monitoring results must be included in the consumer confidence report. And that's also when compliance monitoring will begin. So depending on the results of initial monitoring, that will set your schedule at 2027 going into perpetuity. So really meaning that from 2027 onward, all systems will monitor pretty much at all time. It's at some frequency for PFAS, right? And that just depends on what your previous results say about PFAS in your system. And then finally, public notification for monitoring and testing violations becomes obligatory at this point as well. And then starting perhaps 7 years after rule promulgation, that is when compliance with all MCLs, whether those be just PFOS and PFOA, or those be the rest of the MCLs that are currently drafted or that are currently published, that's when EPA is proposing to start that compliance. and then any public notification for MCL violations becomes mandatory at that point as well. So that is a crash course on PFAS compliance. So if you have any questions on that, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll hand the microphone over to Bill.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, so I will see if I can share. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great, thank you very much. So regarding how the information is shared through the PFAS dashboard, I mean, in the initial stages of this, the questions are, what is needed? What are the business needs? And number one, share information, share background information on
Bill, we
what
lost.
PFAS.
Sorry, we lost your screen.
All right, let's try that again. I think I did it in the wrong order. So you should see my calendar right now. And then,
There you go.
Can you see it now?
Yep,
Yes,
sorry, I was
thank
sharing
you.
my screen.
Sorry. All right, thanks.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've got multiple monitors, and it's hard to remember what each one is doing here. To watch them carefully because they do their own thing. Great. So yeah, so share background information on what they are and why this matters, and what's being done. Share information about the MDH guidance, which was there first, and now that we have EPA standards, to share that. To share system testing status, which moving into this new phase that we're in, that it's there's standards for that and requirements, and that wasn't the case, and so originally the system testing status was of great interest. And finally, indicate which systems are producing water. And then on the technical side, which is my side of things, what do we need to know about the site? Well, it needs to be public facing. It needs to be accessible so that it's available using like screen reader technology, and the information can be shared with the greatest number of people possible, that aren't being stopped by some silly technical reason. But it also needs to protect sensitive data, which, as you probably know, there is non-public information within the to do with drinking water systems, when we need to keep secure. We need to provide as much context as possible, talking about the background information. What that means to me as a technician basically is text heavy. Provide as much stuff as possible. And finally, one size does not fit all for systems. Provide guidance for specific systems, because individual systems have individual results and have the ability to basically provide a custom pop-up message as necessary. All right, kind of went long there, but this is probably not news to you, but this was news to me learning about this. And just the terminology used, for instance, the community water systems have entry points, which are generally after any treatment but before it enters the distribution system. If that sounds like a definition I was handed, you're correct. Thank you, Brian. Entry points can have samples, and samples can be analyzed for results. And the results consist of records for specific analytes that includes the test reporting limits and other metadata. All right, so having gone through the definitions, let's look at the actual processing steps. So every night this runs, and the results are stored in Oracle for a number of reasons. However, Minnesota Department of Health has largely moved to Postgres and is now looking at other databases. But pretty much step one is just getting the data out of where it normally lives and moving it into Postgres working tables. And second, then we loop through steps for the MDH guidance, loop through steps for the EPA processing. We combine everything, they combine like Voltron, and then we copy the data out to our cloud platform, which is ArcGIS Online, where the dashboard is hosted. All right, so there's kind of common steps and methodology for the MDH and EPA processing. We're starting out at the system level where we look at, we'll start by querying a list of every system with results data. We check to see if that system uses the default, which is the most recent results, or if it gets results over an entire past year. Separately, does it do the default, which is using simple minima and maxima, or does it average across samples and entry points? And then we work our way down the hierarchy through entry points and samples and results and going into the analyte. So a lot of looping code, wheels within wheels within wheels. And for each analyte in the results, we check to see, we look for analytes that were flagged as non-detections, and these are considered zeros. We check to see if the value is less than the reporting limit, and if so, that's flagged in the ultimate reporting that people see. And then we start recording the min-max for the selected analytes, and we start building metrics. We build it back up the ladder all the way up to the system level. And then lastly, we use that information to do reporting. We actually build the HTML that you will see in a second, the public sees. We build that in advance every night and then copy it out to ArcGIS Online. All right, so just a quick word about the MDH guidance processing. This is using not the hazard index that Brian described, but the health risk index. And then systems are flagged if any of the following are true. If there's results over the health-based value, HBV, or if the HRI is greater than 1. And then for EPA standards, very similar. Calculating the hazard index, or HI, systems are flagged if the results over the minimum contaminant level. I hope I'm getting that right. Yes, and otherwise, if the hazard index is greater than 1. All right, so let's dive into the well, actually, before I switch over to the dashboard, let me briefly say that, as I mentioned before, it's hosted in ArcGIS Online, which is Esri's cloud web GIS platform. All the data is hosted within ArcGIS Online, so it's hosted feature class. What that means is it lives in the cloud. The one exception is county boundaries. So on a technical level, if you see little differences in drawing speed, county boundaries are coming off of MDH servers. It just for historic reasons. Everything else, though, is again hosted in ArcGIS Online. And finally, a real technical thing: the dashboard is called a story map, and it's a specific type called a map series. So it's basically a series of dashboards of map, table, and dashboards, and then bookended by text-only explanatory tabs, which we will see. So let me switch out of that and switch in to this. So we look at the PFAS dashboard. I mentioned bookended by text. We'll start off with explaining what PFAS are, and then from there we've got a series of maps and a series of tables. This was done for well, primarily accessibility reasons, but also it just kind of makes sense to provide the information in more than one format. We'll take a look at that in a second. But just I wanted to show that we've got, for each kind of topic area, testing status, MDH guidance, EPA standards, we have a map and we have a table, a pair. And then again, bookended by what are we doing? So sorry, why I move over here. So let's look at MDH guidance. So as promised, this is text heavy. I mean, this is a lot going on for a reason, explaining what we have going, what the story is here, what this is about. Obviously, a legend explaining how to read an index, about the sorry, let's go to the something a bit more topical in the news right now, the hazard index. How to read an index, and about the metrics. All right, so let's look a little bit closer into the St. Cloud area. If we look at a given system, say Buffalo, this is very briefly, this is typical for most systems in that there's not much going on really. We just a couple summary level things saying, PFAS above the MCL, no. Hazard index greater than 1, no. And then we don't have any detections there. All right, that's good to know. We can look at a system that is purchasing water. So for instance, St. Augusta, and it purchases water from St. Cloud, so you can St. Cloud for results. Okay, so that information is provided. And we can look at a system that has perhaps more going on, such as Wade Park. Wade Park, we can see that yes, they do have, they are flagged for PFAS levels above the MCL, hazard index greater than 1. And the system is being regularly tested for PFAS. That was more of a thing before we entered the current phase. But you can see which analytes were flagged. And you can see specifically that they have footnoted for results greater than the maximum contaminant level. I actually clicked on the wrong one. Well, close enough. I was going to say, it's hoping you have a few more analytes here, but this is pretty good. All right, so everything you're seeing here, oh, sorry, this is what I wanted to call out. We've got some things here where the minimum that the low end, the minimum value is less than the reporting limit. That's I want to make sure to call that out. So these are surprisingly, I mean, it just looks, I don't know if it looks complex to you, but to me, it looks pretty darn complex. There's a lot going on behind the scenes to cover all these contingencies. And so that's why we pre-generate what we're seeing here overnight, as opposed to doing it on the fly whenever you click on a map, which is typically what you'd see in a dashboard. All right. So one other thing, so let's look at the table for EPA standards here. So it's pretty much the same, to be blunt, pretty much the same information, but provided in tabular form. Let's look at, say, Wade Park. All right, so same information, except there actually is something different going on here. And let me switch over to, oops, there we go, this. Hopefully you can see the, back to the slideshow. So behind the cells in the table, we are actually doing some dynamic work. This is Arcade, which is kind of the standard scripting language for this kind of a dashboard, Esri ArcGIS dashboard. We're actually taking that block of HTML that makes up a map pop-up, and we're deconstructing it so that it looks better in tabular format. So we are doing some dynamic work there. All right, so that's the dashboard. So next steps, Brian?
Yeah, so from a program side, we're going to move from investigative sampling to initial and compliance sampling. So again, in 2027 is kind of when we make that transition. So we're currently collecting all those initial monitoring samples via contract. And then once 2027 hits, that'll be on the public water supply or the district engineer to collect those samples. Then we'll coordinate with public water supplies anticipated to exceed those MCLs and connect communities to resources before. And technically this is still correct, 2029. However, we'll probably push that out to 2031 as far as we know. And we've already been doing that. So pretty much any community that we expect to exceed the MCL gets a call and a written letter from me. And then we more or less put them on that individual entry point on quarterly monitoring through 2027. So, or up until that compliance date. And then basically we're going to prepare the database and compliance processes for continuous monitoring. And that is something that we are currently doing with MNIT, pretty much hand in hand, trying to communicate, what we need from the rule, or what we need from MNDWIS, and how MNIT can interpret the rule to accommodate our requests. And then Bill, I don't know if you want to do the technical.
Yes, thank you.
Side of these, yeah.
Yeah. So on the technical side, then as the program moves into the new phase, then the technical side needs to shift too, as Brian was saying. And as part of that, we are actively reviewing and revising the processing steps. I should have mentioned that the process and the dashboard we're initially devised by the legendary Al here at MDH around 2021, 2022, I think late in 2022. And then actually, no, I think it was summer 2022. Sorry for getting stuck on that. But a lot has changed since then. And so my team has been working on, working on this, adjusting it. But there's still a lot of stuff in the code, in the steps that were important during the investigative phase, but probably aren't necessary during the, the monitoring phase. So we're actively doing that. Kind of related. So actually, so we're simplifying the processing steps. We're actually adding kind of Baroque complexity, more wheels within wheels for one of the steps, and that's getting the data out to ArcGIS Online. It's automatically done every night, and it by and large works fine. However, occasionally a butterfly flaps its wings in Zimbabwe or something like that, or a random cosmic ray zaps a processor, and then we have some kind of issue during the upload or during the rewrite of data on the hosted feature class. And so we want to improve the reliability. Frankly, we've done just about everything we possibly can to catch errors. So now we're kind of getting meta there and no longer looking at what's going wrong, just trying to verify that it's going right. So verifying success. On the front end, you heard me talk about accessibility. The dashboard was designed for accessibility, but if any of you had happened to check out while we were talking or before the dashboard with, say, a screen reader or other assistive technology, you'll find that there are major issues. During some recent changes, like in the past year, it broke a bunch of things that we had built into it for accessibility reasons. So we need to remedy that, absolutely. And we conveniently have we have to rebuild it anyways, because the template it's used, the story map template, is going to be out of support in next year or so. So we're entirely rebuilding the front end, and it should meet WCAG 2.1 accessibility standards, or at least that's our goal. And finally, as the dashboard shifts, we'll reconsider this mix of pre-generated content versus what we normally see, which is a dynamic arcade. And the why that's important is in terms of what we call on the technical side change management. Because the front end, it's fairly simple to make a change or add a pop-up or something like that, or change wording. But the scripts that are part of a nightly job are kind of like held in an armored, a titanium steel box, more or less, where there's multiple levels of paperwork and precaution to make sure that we don't have anything crazy going on with these nightly jobs. So it takes a lot more effort to change those versus, say, doing something on the front end to be able to respond quickly to a dynamic issue. So that's what's on my mind as far as next steps. And that's all. That's our presentation. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see. Whoops. We can start looking at questions.
Got a couple in the
thank
chat.
you so much. There are a bunch in the chat. I'll go ahead and read them out for accessibility purposes, and then you guys can go ahead and respond. So Mark asked, this might be outside the focus of today's talk, but curious what will be the threshold for requiring correction if PFAS is detected? For example, if there is one exceedance of the limit, what response will be required? Is there a minimum number of exceedances that will trigger corrective action?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one thing that I didn't necessarily address in or with those maximum contaminant levels is that they are, being that they are chronic contaminants, right? So it's not like they're not acute contaminants, right? So if we measured something like nitrate and it was over the MCL, that would require action immediately. However, because PFAS are chronic contaminants, the MCL is driven by a quarterly running annual average. So, for PFOA, just for example, the MCL is 4 nanograms per liter. So if in, let's just say St. Paul, for example, gets 5 nanograms per liter in a given quarter, that doesn't mean that they are going to exceed the MCL and receive a violation. That means that it's going to take at least 3 more quarters of that MCL or those results being over that MCL, so that average is higher. So if that average after 4 quarters is higher than the MCL, that is when a violation is issued. And so then if a violation gets issued, we contact the system, we enter into a compliance agreement that requires them to take certain forms of action, whether that being, cycling that entry point off or that well off, consulting with a consultant, and trying to see what their options are going forward. Whether that be, again, installing treatments, cycling that well off, connecting to a different system, so on and so forth. So I think that answered most of your question, but curious if PFAS is detected. So that would be, of course, if they receive an MCL violation. But if you are, and that is, that quarterly running annual average is above the MCL. If you are below the MCL, obviously that's not a violation, and systems aren't obligated to perform any form of remediate or of treatment, right? Or action, or corrective action. That being said, obviously, systems want to get ahead of that, and they're enticed not to, get close to the MCL. But being that the MCL is so low, many systems do have trace detections of PFAS. And again, PFAS, there's more, like we saw in the slide, there's more than 10,000 of these things, and there's more than 10,000 of these things. We test for 30 of them. There are rules and regulations for 6 of them. So that being said, we can detect 24 different types of PFAS, or I should say 29. We can detect 23 different forms of PFAS that don't have regulations. So for example, PFBA is very, very common. It's a short chain compound that you find basically everywhere. And so, that's, I guess, a reason why we have these state, health-based guidance values, is that even though there's no federal regulation on the book to regulate that, if, PFBA were to, approach their health-based guidance value, then MDH would reach out on the state level and say, hey, you might want to look at this. Now, again, that isn't comprehensive. We don't have HBVs for many of the PFAS we can test for. So, that's why it's, kind of this ongoing process of trying to figure out which ones are the most toxic, which ones do we have to pay attention to, which ones require action, so on and so forth. So I hope that answered your question.
All right. Michael made a comment about a chart that you showed in your presentation that may or may not have had the hurls on it instead of the HBVs. I cannot confirm or deny. But Michael, maybe you can talk to them about that offline.
Yeah, it said HBVs in the title, but it was listing the hurls within the data itself. So.
Yep, that's a eagle-eye distinction. Thank you, Michael. So yes, there is a subtle yet important difference between hurls and HBVs. HBV, they both have the same, correct me if I'm wrong, like research requirements, like rigor. I think they're just essentially the same amount of like academic rigor goes into establishing those standards. However, HBVs aren't promulgated. They aren't like quote unquote official yet. So they're essentially the same. HBVs are essentially the same values as hurls. They just haven't been, I guess, given the blessing by the state legislature. Is that the difference?
Nailed it. Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. Exact same toxicological values throughout there, but we only do rulemaking every couple of years on there, which is a large process. But HBVs are usually pre-hurls. There's been a couple times when they've stepped back and looked back at those, but we use them interchangeably. But it does come into play if you've got, like in the remediation division over here, if you have a CERCLA site, a federal Superfund site, your hurls are ARARs because they're promulgated, but an HBV is just a to be considered because it's not promulgated yet. So unless you're deep into the weeds of regulatory information on federal cleanups, you can treat them the same.
And there is a real important difference on that particular slide too, is that for PFOA and PFOS, we recently, well, actually, I should say recently, it's been a year and a half now, but last year in 2024, we revised, I think it was on my slide, if I can bring it up, but when you saw all that, there was that chart of all the HPVs that started at like 7,000 in 2002, and then we've like dropped them precipitously over the years. Last year, so the hurls that were posted on that slide were like 35 and 15 for PFOS and PFOA respectively, right? Or I think it's the other way around. Last year, we dropped the PFOA from 35 down to 0.0079. So that is, you know, what do you call that? Magnitudes of orders of magnitude lower, right? And that is because we just know that much more now about, you know, how toxic PFOA can be. The same being true for PFOS. It wasn't quite as low as PFOA, but that's still very, you know, very far down there. So those again are HBVs. Those are the non-promulgated values. They haven't been given the blessing by the legislature. And the reason that it made it onto the slide that you saw is because those values are not used in the calculation of the hazard of the health risk index. The health risk index is kind of that state level assessment of PFAS occurring in mixtures. So, and again, that's been a perpetual, I don't want to say guillotine, but it's just been kind of floating above us, and we have no idea when the decision will be made. So at the moment, that is what the dashboard uses. Until we have a decision, that's when we'll change the hurl on the dashboard to accommodate for whether to or not to accommodate for these new values. So I hope that was not as convoluted as it really is, but I hope that was clear.
Yeah, I think so. And so I'm going to get to Mark's question in a second, but kind of jumping off of that, I am curious if you guys could talk a little bit about the recent EPA announcement with the MCLs and MCLGs and how that is changing the landscape. Obviously, this is very new and things are changing, but I'm just curious if you could speak on that and kind of what MDH is thinking about it.
Yeah, and so again, like, it's an important announcement. It sets new precedent, but it is a press release, and that is the only thing it is at this point. So that does not change the published rule, the promulgated rule. So at this moment, until we have something new, all those MCLs are still in play. However, we have a very heavy indication that those MCLs will be changing at some point, right? Or they will be revised. So, however, that doesn't change our current action. So what we're doing for initial monitoring, luckily it doesn't mess with that. So I think there would have been much more of an uproar across the 50 states because if those initial monitoring in all of our, because everyone's 5 months into collecting samples, and luckily those weren't changed, right? We can still go forward and collect all that. So all that to say, if you're testing for PFOA, you're going to find the other MCLs that are there. So we're still able to track all that. We still have all that data. The main difference is that on our list before a few weeks ago, we had 24 systems that were exceeding the MCLs, whether that be PFOA, whether that be PFOS, so on and so forth. But because of the announcement of that they're going to rescind or reevaluate 4 out of the remaining 6, or the remaining 4 out of the 6, 2 of those systems drop off of that list. So it goes from 24 to 22. So we're in communications with each one of those systems to say, hey, technically there's a good chance you might not get a violation in 2031. However, you still should, you still have elevated levels of the ones that will, like PFOA, PFOS. So it's going to be prudent to keep, developing solutions for this and keeping your eye on it, even though you probably won't, get a violation.
Sure. Okay. And then I guess another follow-up on that. So I work in the East Metro unit, so I deal with PFAS every day. And we currently issue well advisories based on the 10 nanogram per liter MCL. So if that changes in the future, would well advisories that were issued based on that number become, invalid or something like that? Or does MDH feel good about the science that those numbers were kind of based on and feel like we can, continue using these numbers for the time being?
Great question. I think that would come down to more like the HSA unit. And I'd have to I'm not, I can't speak to the toxicological effects and, whether the 10 nanograms per liter limit is apt for PFHXS or GenX or PFNA.
Yeah.
But I know, like I said, at the moment, that's still the rule. So I think until we get word that it'll change, we continue forward with that.
Okay.
Because the reality exists that they could just stay the same and that nothing happens with them.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. All right. Mark asked, when we say connect communities to resources for those that exceed MCLs, what kind of resources are we talking about?
Another great question. Primarily, we're talking about financial resources, about either performing, some form of an investigation, like hiring a consultant to, look at how they are going to address PFAS or address their sources. It would be about implementing treatment. So things like connecting them to the Drinking Water Revolving Fund, the PFA, so getting on the project priority list. And then finally, doing a referral through the priority 1, 2, 3 process that's literally just restarting now. So connecting them to people like the MPCA. So you can perform some form of a site investigation to determine, okay, where's my PFAS coming from? How do we delineate this plume? Is there a responsible party?
Yeah, I believe they get referred to our site assessment program.
And note that is only for systems that exceed the MCL up until this point. So some of the systems that are on the bubble, and there are systems that are on the bubble, do not get that referral, and they do not get those resources because they do not exceed the MCL. Does that mean that they don't have a PFAS problem?
No. Mark had a good question in the chat that Michael answered, but I'll just read it out because I think it's a very good question. Can analytical techniques measure down to 0.0079 for PFOA reliably? And the answer is no. Michael said the lowest detection limit we've seen in our thousands of PFAS samples at MPCA is 0.09 nanograms per liter with a reporting limit of 0.664. See, just looking through here, I'm not seeing any other questions. So if anybody has anything, feel free to drop it in there or just unmute and ask.
One thing
I will just say, good.
Sorry, go ahead, Brian. No.
Just to clear the air on the 0.0079, that is a state level. That is a health-based guidance value. That's not an enforceable limit. So that's just what we do in the state. We can't enforce that. What would happen if we decided to say, okay, that's our new health-based guidance value for drinking water, we would issue them some form of a health risk advisory, but that would encourage action, but not enforce it, if that makes sense.
Thanks for that clarification.
Just wanted to say something I should have said earlier when I'm talking about accessibility, in that one of the rules of presenting is to know your audience, and MPCA has led, as far as I'm concerned, is leading state agencies in terms of making data accessible. So we were trying to, we've got some work to do to reach the level that PCA has set. You got really sharp people working on that issue.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so I think we can probably wrap this up for today. Fox, do you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you, Bill, for acknowledging that. And if folks aren't on this call, we'll make sure that message gets passed on. I'm curious about if you're tracking visits to the dashboard and the associated kind of landing page. Do you have an idea of how much traffic that's getting? from
that's a
where it
good
might be
question.
coming from. I probably open that map like an average of 6 times a week, so some of it's from me, but
Yeah, I'll have to. I don't have the numbers in front of it. Yeah. So one thing about ArcGIS Online, you can see, by the way, my face is getting blinding off because I'm switching the browser page there. The one thing about ArcGIS Online, they do show a number of views for like the initial page and then for individual resources. So you can kind of get an idea of what tabs are being viewed. Actually, I don't have any numbers right now though. That's a good question. That'd actually be something nice to include in the deck.
great, thank you.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I think we can actually wrap up this time. Thank you both so much for your time. This was an incredibly interesting talk, and I think something that a lot of us are thinking about a lot of the time these days. So we really appreciate you presenting. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your Thursday, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you both. See everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.